From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. On behalf of the Library of Congress, I'd like to welcome you to the National Book Festival. My name is Carlos Lozada. I'm the editor of the Washington Post Sunday Outlook. The Post has been a charter sponsor of the festival from the very beginning, 12 years ago, and I hope will be for many years to come. Now, we're here to discuss Aaron Burr, and it's probably safe to say that when most of us think of Aaron Burr, we think of the Duel. Burr Hamilton, Weehawken, New Jersey, summer 1804. It was a pretty big deal, right? Two of the biggest political players of the age. The sitting vice president, the former Treasury Secretary, the latter is fatally wounded. Yet, as you discover fairly quickly after picking up American Emperor, David Stewart's new book, is that that may not be the most exciting or dramatic moment in Aaron Burr's life. Stewart tells what has to be one of the most extraordinary second acts in American politics, how Burr leads an armed band to the west, tries to break off a few states from the Union, plots a couple of invasions, maybe Florida, Mexico, ultimately is tried for treason in a trial so huge and so dramatic that the Chief Justice was the presiding judge and two former attorneys general were on the defense team. Stewart isn't just telling the story of Aaron Burr's life or second act, he's also describing an America at a time when the nation was still not fully formed, neither in its geography or in its values. David Stewart is a longtime lawyer turned historian who studies, as he puts it, episodes that are not well understood but are centrally important to America's development as a nation. And this nation of readers is all the better for it. There will be time for questions at the end. You can hit the two mics here in the aisle. And I should inform you that these presentations are being filmed for the Library of Congress's website and for the archives, and C-SPAN will be airing them on Book TV. So please be on your best behavior. Please join me in welcoming David Stewart.
Thank you very much, Carlos, and thank you all for coming here for this widely coveted slot, which I think of as the fourth period of the Redskins game, or arguably the seventh inning of the Nationals game. So you're all very good to put up with this. I want to talk, of course, about Aaron Burr, and he was a vice president like no other. He was running for vice president, but he almost became president in 1800 when he finished in a tie with his running mate, Thomas Jefferson. Of course, as Carlos mentioned, he killed a former cabinet member in a duel while he was still in office. And then he was arrested for treason and faced the gallows if he was convicted. We have not had a vice president like Aaron Burr, not even Dick Cheney, although he did shoot a guy. I do like to point out, though, that Burr shot the guy he was aiming at. Just to start with a little background on what the country was like and what Aaron Burr was like, because the story makes more sense that way. The Constitution had been in effect for fewer than 20 years. The United States was an infant, and it didn't work terribly well in the election of 1800. It worked terribly. We had this presidential election that required 36 ballots in the House of Representatives to be resolved between Burr and Jefferson, the supposed running mates. There were secession movements in New England. There was a secession movement out west that had been going on for a number of years. We had two rebellions in Pennsylvania in the 1790s. Because they were American rebellions, they were led by people who didn't want to pay taxes. And in 1804, the president, Thomas Jefferson, actually wrote two letters in which he expresses bland indifference at the prospect that the nation would fall apart. He says, "Whether we remain in one confederacy or form into Atlantic and Mississippi confederacies, I believe not very important to the happiness of either part. Those of the Western Confederacy will be as much our children and descendants as those of the Eastern. And I feel myself as much identified with that country in future time as with this." Now imagine if Barack Obama were to say today, well, California, if they want to go their own way, whatever. I mean, it's an astonishing thing that a president of the United States would say, well, if part of the country breaks off, that's okay. But it does give you a sense of just how fluid things really were. We had just bought the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the size of the country. Florida was still in Spanish hands. Texas and all the rest of the West was in Spanish hands. It was a very different map from what we're used to today. Now, in this fluid situation, we find Aaron Burr. He came from a distinguished family, not a lot of money. His father had been president of the College of New Jersey, now Princeton. His grandfather had been president and was also Jonathan Edwards, the great theologian, who said famously that we are all sinners in the hands of an angry God. It was a harsh message, but they were harsh times. Burr, as a teenager, volunteered to join the Continental Army. He rose very quickly. He was a brave and popular officer. He became a colonel. While still a teenager, he led a regiment at the Battle of Monmouth and was very distinguished. And men who served with him were his political base for the rest of his life. And it's an interesting thing. He was a small, slight man, yet he was the toughest guy in the Army. When they had this terrible expedition they took up to try to conquer Quebec in 1775, and all these very rough, tough frontiersmen sort of fell by the wayside, got sick, had to go home, whereas this slender, small teenager turned out to be the guy who was at the gates of Quebec with General Montgomery. After the war, Burr was politically successful. He was Attorney General of New York, then Senator from New York, and he became a master of the art of electioneering. This was a period when candidates stood for office. They didn't run for office, but Burr was far too impatient a man to do that. He wanted to run for office. He organized canvasses of voters. In the 1800 election, he had canvassers living in his house for a month, and they went door to door, and they gathered up their voters, and they delivered them right to the polls, just the way it is done today. And it was the first time we'd really done that in this country, and that's really why he was on the Republican ticket. But there was also always something unconventional about Aaron Burr. He is, and comes to us as the bad boy of the founding. He had a different and rather bracing outlook about his contemporaries, whom we tend to mythologize. He thought George Washington was a bit dim. He thought Hamilton was a boor, and he thought Jefferson was a coward. He made an unconventional marriage choice. He married a woman 10 years older than he, who was the widow of a British officer. In 1782, marrying the widow of a British officer was sort of a gutsy thing to do. Indeed, when they first started keeping company, she was not a widow, and her then husband did die shortly thereafter, and Burr was nowhere near him when he died. So he's clear on that one. But he was also always an advocate of women's rights in a very modern way. He kept a framed portrait of Mary Wollstonecraft, the great advocate of women's rights in Britain, over his fireplace. He viewed the education of his daughter, Theodosia, as sort of an object lesson or an experiment in showing all of the talents that women really had. So she was educated the way any privileged, young man of privilege would have been educated at the time. She was taught all the classical languages, and she routinely dazzled people when they met her. He also admired not only the intellectual qualities of women. He was an avid ladies' man and was widely reputed to be that. He was a single gentleman from the age of 37 to 77 when he remarried. He was a widower, and devoted the time well by all accounts. After he died, one of his old friends said, "It's amazing that Colonel Burr achieved as much as he did in view of all the time he spent chasing women." He had a bewitching mix of elements that's very difficult to capture today or years later, because he had a charisma and a magnetism that was uniquely personal. He didn't have a big personality. Alexander Hamilton, by all accounts, would enter a room and he'd call out and tell stories in a loud voice, and if he'd had enough to drink, he'd jump up on the table and sing songs. Burr was quiet and reserved, but there was a mystery to him, and there was an element of secrets that he conveyed. It is interesting that as a lawyer, his famous maxim to his legal colleagues was to say, "Things written remain." And that was not an endorsement of things remaining. What he meant was, don't write anything down. And it's a fascinating comparison because Burr's collected political writings fill 2 volumes. Alexander Hamilton's collected political writings fill 35 volumes. And Hamilton lived 30 years less than Burr, which is, of course, not an accident. So Burr was a guy who dwelt in mystery, and that's what you find with this Western expedition. Now, the story really picks up in 1804, which is Aaron Burr's very bad year. He is not nominated for a second term as vice president. Jefferson has never really cottoned to him very much, certainly not after the face-off in the 1800 election, when Burr did not withdraw from the race for a long time and allowed that decision to linger. Burr was then going to repair his political career by running for governor of New York, and he got thumped. He lost by the largest margin anybody had lost by up until that time. Then, as a fallout from that race, he has the duel with Hamilton. The duel, of course, happens over in New Jersey, and Burr comes back to New York, and within a day or two, he's shocked to discover that although it's clear Hamilton has lost the duel, we know that much, it turns out he hasn't won it, because Hamilton has become a secular saint. He becomes a martyr as the result of the duel. There's this tremendous outpouring of sympathy for Hamilton, and within a couple of weeks, Burr is indicted for murder in New York State. And then he's indicted for murder in New Jersey. So you have the Vice President of the United States who's under indictment in 2 of the 17 states of the Union. So he does what any good criminal defendant would do. He takes it on the lam, and he heads off for Pennsylvania, where he won't get arrested. And he then heads south, and he basically hides in the South for about 2 months, finally comes back and completes his term as vice president while still under indictment. He does realize, as optimistic a fellow as he is, that at this point, his political career by conventional means is really over. And he resolves, like a lot of Americans, that when his career goes south, he will go west. So he heads out west just a few weeks after his vice presidential career ends. This is where the mystery really begins. He spends 6 months traveling through the West, going down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. The travel on the rivers was always much easier. Then he comes back through the forests. Again, he's a man in his late 40s at this point, but he's still a tough guy. He's camping out, he's eating what he can kill, and he's seeing all of the prominent men out west. Now, many of them are Continental Army veterans, because one of the things we did during the war was not pay our soldiers very well, so we made it up to them by giving them the rights to land out west. And so many settled out there, and they remembered him very fondly. Now, because he'd been such a young man, many of them were older, so he was really recruiting their sons, and he did recruit their sons for an expedition. He met with 2 future presidents, Andrew Jackson and William Henry Harrison. He met with 3 senators, but the most important man he met with was a figure who makes Burr almost seem mundane in his preposterousness, this fellow who was the general-in-chief of our army, James Wilkinson. Wilkinson was, at the same time he was general-in-chief of our army, secret agent number 13 for the King of Spain, and had been a secret agent for Spain, accepting bribes from Spain, for about 20 years. Theodore Roosevelt said of Wilkinson, "In all our history, there is no more despicable character." He was a florid, extravagant, hard-drinking fellow who had few military achievements. It was said of him, and he had been court-martialed several times but never convicted, it was said of him that he had never won a battle or lost an investigation. And he was really head of the army by default. In 1805, nobody wanted to be in the Army. The Army was full of 3,000 people. It had only 3,000 people. It was full of really the dregs of the country. It was not considered a terribly important or honorable profession. Wilkinson gave regular reports to the Spaniards. It's not clear to me that they really got value for what he was sending them, for what they paid for. But you get a little flavor for what Wilkinson was like as a person. There's one episode with the handover of the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson sent Wilkinson down to New Orleans to accept Louisiana from the French in a formal ceremony. They had a big ball to celebrate this, and there was a serious issue there because the Creoles who lived in Louisiana, they were the French-speaking people who had been living there for many generations, didn't want to be part of the United States. It was a foreign country, it was a foreign language, it was a foreign culture. They simply wanted nothing to do with it. So to try to keep the peace, at this formal ball, they arranged to play one American song and one French song and one American song and one French song. So of course Wilkinson drinks a little too much, and he demands 2 American songs in a row. And one of the odd parts of the story is that the second American song is Rule Britannia, which presumably is chosen for its ability to annoy French people much more than any American quality it has. Once they finish that, all the French people spontaneously jump up and belt out a couple of choruses of La Marseillaise. And when they finish, a brawl breaks out, and ultimately Wilkinson leads the Americans from the chamber in triumph. And as you're doubtless thinking, the only thing that's missing is Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman. But this is the sort of simultaneously larger and smaller than life figure that James Wilkinson really was. He and Burr reach agreement on the outlines of a plan, and it is an outrageous plan for this expedition out west. Burr was to recruit volunteers, private volunteers for this expedition, and Wilkinson was to bring Army troops. And when Burr was recruiting men, he told them that the Atlantic states were exploiting the West, and in this time the West is really Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee. That's the West. And he says that the West in 1805 stands in the same position with respect to the Atlantic states that the 13 original states stood with respect to Britain in 1776. Now this is almost breathtaking. This is a former vice president of the United States who's just a few months from office saying, essentially, you should rebel. And the message is quite clear. He tells people that the separation of the West from the rest of the country is inevitable, that war with Spain over Mexico is highly desirable, Mexico was there for the taking, and that there were huge piles of silver just waiting to be taken. Now that part was true. Mexico was producing 2/3 of the world's silver at that point. And he also made an appeal to sort of export democracy, that this was an opportunity to relieve the Spanish masses who were groaning under the yoke of their the Mexican masses who were groaning under the yoke of their Spanish oppressors. And as we all know, the notion of exporting democracy has a lot of appeal to Americans, and it did 2 centuries ago. He also talked about that the Creoles in Louisiana would want, of course, to rebel and get their own independence because they had so little to do with the United States. Now, there has been confusion about Burr's goals. What did he really mean to do? It's clear he meant to lead an invasion of Mexico and Florida. They were Spanish territories. I think what he meant to do was whatever he could get away with. And I think of him in the sense of this character from an old Marlon Brando movie, The Wild Ones. You may recall Brando is the head of a motorcycle gang that takes over a little California town in rather a quaint fashion. And halfway through the movie, the lady, the sweet young thing says to Brando, "So, Johnny, what are you rebelling against?" And Brando says, "Well, what do you got?" And I think Burr was at that stage. He knew that he was meant for greatness, that he could be a great man. He had seen Washington, he had seen Jefferson, and he had seen these others close up, and he knew he had all of the talents they did. But he could not make that work after the Hamilton duel. So he was off to do whatever great thing he could do. And in this time frame, there was a concept that all of our founding fathers wrote about and talked about of fame. And fame wasn't a sort of empty celebrityhood, the sort of thing we associate with people named Kim these days. It was something that recognized your integrity. You were known to people because of your worth, because you did something important, because you stood for something. And he wanted that more than anything. He had a burning ambition. And that's what I think he was out west to do. And I think he had a matrix of possible outcomes. I think it was one of the problems was that there were too many possible outcomes that made him a little unfocused in his leadership, but that's what he was after. Now, when the expedition finally kicks off, it is an epic botch. He has built boats sufficient to transport 1,500 private citizens, armed citizens, down the rivers, but only 100 show up. And he's shocked by this, but the reasons are some things start going bad for him. There's a prosecutor in Kentucky who tries to prosecute him for starting a war with Spain. The prosecution falls short. The grand jury won't even indict Burr, but it creates terribly negative feelings about Burr and a lot of doubts about his expedition. There's a fellow he has tried to recruit named William Eaton, who issues a public statement saying Burr intended to take over Washington, D.C. and throw the president and Congress out of office. There's not much evidence from anybody else that he meant to do that, but gee, that's not good publicity. That's pretty negative stuff. And Jefferson, who has known about Burr and his Western activities for 18 months, and this is one of the shocking things about the case for me, is it's sometimes referred to as the Burr Conspiracy, and I never use that term because conspiracies are secret. And there were thousands of people who knew what he was doing. It was in the newspapers. It was in the Kentucky newspaper did a 15-part series on it. And it was no secret at all. And Jefferson did nothing. Finally, he issues a proclamation, doesn't mention Burr, but he says there's people out west who are up to no good, and no good American should have anything to do with them. And it all sort of takes the air out of the expedition. So he heads off down the river. He makes a last-ditch attempt to get Andrew Jackson in the program. Jackson now has cold feet. He won't participate. And he's still hoping that Wilkinson will show up. Wilkinson is in what's now western Louisiana, faced off against the Spaniards. He's got a perfect opportunity to start a war, or at least to bring the troops to Burr's support. And he gets a letter from Burr saying, I am coming, on to glory, let's make history. And Wilkinson, who is a double agent, of course, decides he will double-cross Burr. So he becomes a triple agent. And he immediately sends false documents to Jefferson, making charges against Burr that are not true, and professing his own innocence, which is not true. And by the time Burr gets down to Mississippi, just above Natchez, he is arrested. And he is ultimately hauled before a grand jury. They won't charge him, but he's still held on bond. He jumps bail. Just not a lot of vice presidents do this. He jumps bail, and he's arrested in the backwoods of Alabama and hauled to Richmond and put on trial for treason. And this is the first American trial of the century. Now, most of you know that in most centuries we have about a dozen trials of the century. But this was our first, and it's a pretty solid candidate. Imagine what Fox News or CNN would do with a trial of a former vice president who is facing hanging for treason. He does recruit an amazing legal dream team. He's got 2 former attorneys general. He's got 2 men who were delegates to the Constitutional Convention. He's the best lawyer in the room. He's a terrific lawyer. The prosecutors include a man who will go on to argue 140-some cases in the Supreme Court, William Wirt. And the case involves some terribly important issues. Even before the trial starts, Chief Justice Marshall, who is presiding, hands down an opinion about the power of habeas corpus. This is the requirement that you can't be held in prison without charges. And some people were arrested in New Orleans by General Wilkinson and sent back east to face trial. They brought habeas corpus petitions, and Chief Justice Marshall ruled that even though national security was at stake, even though these charges were treason, you still had a right to habeas corpus review by the courts. Now that was a critical precedent. That's where the reasoning started in all of these Guantanamo cases we've had over the last 10 years. It's still terribly important law. The executive privilege doctrine began in this case. Burr immediately subpoenaed Jefferson's records, wanted to find out what Jefferson had heard from Wilkinson. Jefferson said, "Wait a second, I'm the president. I don't have to give you my records." And Chief Justice Marshall ruled, well, you're the president, but you're not the king. And if your records do not involve national security issues, you do have to turn them over. And I will be the judge of that as the court. And that's the same doctrine we still have. That's the doctrine that applied during the Watergate case. That's when he had the Solyndra dust up a year ago. That was called into play there as well. Now, the trial itself was a moment of extraordinary oratory. It is a time of extraordinary oratory. Courtrooms were places of public entertainment almost as much as of justice. Burr had a defense lawyer, Luther Martin from Maryland, who was famous for drinking brandy all the way through the trial day, something I admire but would never try to mimic. He gave a 2-day speech on a procedural motion. It took 14 hours, and his closing argument was 3 days. Well, that's 21 hours. One of the lasting legacies of the trial is the closing argument that William Wirt gave for the prosecution. The Who Was Blennerhassett speech was assigned to schoolboy orators to memorize for the next 100 years. It thoroughly destroyed Burr's reputation in history, since it quite squarely compares him to the serpent in the Garden of Eden. So we had 5 generations of Americans hear that Burr was the devil. There was, however, a core flaw to the case. Jefferson really drove this prosecution. He had slept really through most of Burr's planning, but once Burr was arrested, he desperately wanted him convicted and at least put away for a long, long time, if not hanged. And so he wrote 24 letters to the prosecutor directing him what to do. He wrote, he filled out blank pardons for the prosecutor to give to witnesses to get them to testify. And he stage managed this thing and made a terrible rookie blunder. He didn't want the case tried out west, because 2 grand juries out west had already looked at Burr's case and not brought any charges against him. So he charged him in Virginia. And that had 2 problems. One was it meant Chief Justice Marshall would preside over the case under the rules in effect at the time. The other was to get what's called venue, to show that something happened in Virginia that was the treason. He had to charge that it happened on this one island in the Ohio River. It's now part of West Virginia, but that used to be Virginia, on Blennerhassett Island. And the problem was that Burr wasn't there. It was not a case that could ever have succeeded. Now, as it was tried, another important thing happened, which was Chief Justice Marshall applied the constitutional provision about treason. In the Constitutional Convention, the delegates had worried a lot about the treason power. The British kings had used it for centuries to oppress and to defeat their opponents. It was very fluid, didn't require much evidence, much proof, and it was it was a real threat to personal liberty. So they adopted an extraordinarily narrow treason provision. It's the only crime that's defined in the Constitution. And in order to demonstrate treason, it either has to be giving aid and comfort to the enemy or raising arms against the government. And you have to have 2 witnesses to an overt act of treason or a confession. Now that's really demanding, and Chief Justice Marshall kept saying, where are the overt acts of treason, as the testimony was coming in. Prosecutors had 100 witnesses, and after 14 witnesses, they finally said, that's the best we've got. And at that point, Marshall cut off the evidence, and he sent the case to the jury. And the jury, which had been profoundly anti-Burr, came back with a verdict of not guilty. They couldn't avoid coming back with some sort of not guilty verdict, but what they wrote was that the defendant was not proved to be guilty under this indictment by any evidence submitted to us. It just drips with disappointment. You can tell that if they'd just had a shred of evidence, they would have convicted the guy. And in fact, there was a lot of evidence that didn't make it into the courtroom. To get that, you'll have to read the book. But Burr was an extraordinarily effective lawyer, and he was really effective at making sure that nobody testified against him and knew anything, and that a lot of documents disappeared. There's one amazing exchange where he and Wilkinson each declined to produce each other's records, saying that no gentleman would ever disclose the confidential letters of another gentleman. And for some reason, that is allowed to stand, which I never did quite figure out. It is, however, it's both an amazing adventure story and a courtroom thriller, but there are also some substantial consequences that come from this episode. And I have to concede that not all were intended by Aaron Burr, but they were still important to us. First, I do think his failure reinforced the Union. Secession was in the air at the time. New England would continue to flirt with it, actually. Of course, it wasn't extinguished as an idea. We fought the Civil War about that some 50 years later. But I think his failure helped make secession unattractive, and he had invited basically one part of the country to secede from the rest, and they had declined. And I think that was an important moment. The legal principles articulated by Chief Justice Marshall, and if there's a hero in this story, it is Chief Justice Marshall, survive and make it terribly important. His narrow application of the treason provisions was terribly important. We had treason prosecutions in the 1790s where the judges applied the old British law. They didn't apply the constitutional standard. And Marshall insisted on the constitutional standard. The habeas corpus issue, the executive privilege issue, but there's one overarching issue, which is Marshall held basically every day that even though Aaron Burr was in some sense the most despised man in America at that time, he was the man who had killed Hamilton, he was the man who was trying to scheme to break up the country, he was accused of treason. This trial had been on the front page of every newspaper in the country for 3 months. There was really nothing else that was happening in the country that was covered in the newspapers. Even though you are the devil, you are still entitled to every right that the law and the Constitution grants to you, and the courts will make sure that you get those rights. And that's a terribly important lesson that we need to learn in this country. We probably need to learn it every generation. But the first time it was really taught was by Chief Justice Marshall in the Burr case. Now, to give Burr some credit, you do have to acknowledge that his geopolitical vision was true, that the lands he craved to conquer, to create a new empire of his own or to make part of the United States, however it might happen, were in fact there for the taking. And he knew that whoever took them would win the fame and honor that he craved so much. Andrew Jackson took Florida in 1818, and that was a big part of his campaign for president some 10 years later. Sam Houston won the glory of leading the Texas independence in the 1830s and became the founding father of a new nation. Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott completed Burr's invasion of Mexico in the next decade. Those were triumphs that put Taylor in the White House and made Scott an unsuccessful candidate for the presidency. Indeed, one of the symmetrical moments in American history happens in 1835 when Burr reads about the Texas independence movement in the newspaper, and he calls out, he proclaims, "I was right. I was just 32 years ahead of my time. What was treason in me is patriotism now." And he was right, but vindication, and it was only vindication of a sort, came awfully late for Aaron Burr. Thank you. I would be happy to take questions. There are the 2 microphones there. Yes, sir.
You may not care to speculate, but if you're willing to, I wonder whether had Burr managed to edge into the presidency in 1800, what kind of president do you think he might have made? Did he have it in him to be a successful president?
I actually think he would have been a very fine president. He had his flaws, but he got into trouble when he was denied power. When he was granted power, he tended to behave extraordinarily well. His performance as vice president was widely admired by senators from both parties. He presided over the Senate for 4 years. He was determinedly nonpartisan. Although he was a Republican in name, the Republicans never quite trusted him because he had so many Federalist friends. Federalists didn't quite trust him because he was with the Republicans. He really didn't like parties, and he liked the notion of doing the right thing. It's fascinating to read Hamilton's letters. Hamilton had this terrible rivalry with Burr for a long time. And when he would denounce Burr, which he routinely did, he would often say, well, of course, everything he says is fine, and his policy positions are fine. Well, and then he goes on to say, but I just don't trust the guy. But the fact is, I think he would have been a very centrist president, and someone, compared to Jefferson, he would have been a more activist president. He always had a military quality. But I think he was a much better bet with power than without it. Yes, sir.
Hi. I just wanted to ask what your thoughts are on what may have been the fate of Aaron Burr's daughter, Theodosia Burr. I know the story is she traveled from South Carolina to New York to visit her father, and there's speculation she was shipwrecked off the coast of North Carolina. I just want to know your thoughts on that.
This is one of the terribly poignant parts of the Aaron Burr story, which is there was really only one person. He only had one legitimate child. It's thought he had several illegitimate children. It was Theodosia, whom he doted on. He wrote the most wonderful letters to her, and she back. It seemed like an extraordinary relationship. After he is acquitted, he actually goes off to Europe for 4 years to try to talk the British and then the French into underwriting him to liberate South America. This is where he went from the highly aggressive to the delusional. This was not going to happen, but he gave it a shot, give him credit. And he's over there for 4 years. He comes back. He really has to sneak into the country in disguise. There are all these indictments still out against him. He's not sure what's going to happen. The president hates him. So he immediately sends word. He discovers it's okay. He doesn't have to keep his disguise on. He sends word to South Carolina, where she lives with her husband, for her to come to New York. He sends a man to escort her. They get on a boat in, I forget the name of the town, in South Carolina, and the ship is never seen again. And she is never seen, and there's this story that for months thereafter, Burr would go down to the waterfront every morning and pace the wharf looking for his daughter. It's pretty terrible. There is a myth that she was shipwrecked on the coast and lived, or that she was captured by pirates and became a pirate's mistress and raised all her children. There was a novel actually that came out last year along that retailed that particular fantasy. I don't think there's any evidence to support any of that. I think the ship went down. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I also had a question about Theodosia. Earlier on, I have this memory bubble that there was something scandalous involved with her and her role in his life. Maybe I'm completely misremembering. And how was her elite education received at the time, and how did she carry out her life with all of this learning and no place to go with it?
Okay. Your first question again?
Well, was there something?
Scandal, yes.
Yeah.
I think you are maybe remembering Gore Vidal's novel Burr, in which he hypothesizes, And he is very clear that he's hypothesizing that the thing Hamilton says that ticks off Burr, and there is something Hamilton says that ticks off Burr, is that Burr is sleeping with his daughter.
Okay.
And it certainly would have made most people angry. I don't know if that's it. The other thing you could be remembering is when she married, she was only 17, she married the son of the richest family in South Carolina, and it was said by people who didn't like Burr that he had married her off in order to get into her her husband's family's money. And it does appear he did get his snout into her husband's family's money. So those are the two possible things. Now, in terms of Theodosia's reception, her husband, who was this terribly wealthy guy, who became governor of South Carolina and was actually a candidate for president, possible candidate for president in 1816, doted on her. And there's every evidence that after she dies and disappears, that he basically wastes away. So it would appear that at least her education was well received there. And the written recollections of her are extraordinarily fond and positive. So I think it was well received.
Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. I noticed in your early part of your remarks that you said that he came from a distinguished but not wealthy family. How did he manage to field such a distinguished legal team to defend him against those charges?
Yeah, he didn't pay them. There's a phenomenon, and I can speak comfortably about this, having done a lot of criminal defense work. There is a phenomenon that if the case is going to get enough attention, lawyers will do it for free. And you're just in it for the notoriety and the attention, and that's what happened. He borrowed a lot of money through his life from people and never really paid it back. There were a lot of men. When he got to Richmond, when he was in jail and facing trial, I think there was something like 13 lawsuits were filed against him in Richmond within a week to try to recover loans. So he never really had a lot of money. He did, the last 15, 20 years of his life, he did practice law and earned some money and paid back some people. But mostly he just did it on style. I think this will be the last question.
Hello?
Yes.
In my
You
reading,
might tilt that down.
in my reading, I've come across this term to describe the term filibuster to describe Burr's military adventures, and I wondered if there's any connection between that and the more common word, to describe what goes on in Congress.
This is a linguistic peculiarity that filibuster in the early 19th century meant sort of a buccaneering expedition down into Spanish territory. And there were a bunch of filibustering expeditions, and Burrs can be seen as part of that, although I think that belittles it, because a lot of those were really just adventures, and Burr really had much more in mind. The linguistic connection to what goes on in the Senate, that sort of catastrophe, I am unable to help you with. But that did not come into play until many years later. So thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.